Welcome to a very special and unusual episode of Let Them Eat Bread. We are filming from my personal office today as opposed to the kitchen studio, and that's because we are not making bread this week, as I announced on our Facebook page. Instead, we're going to talk a little bit about what to do if you've made too much bread, how to store bread, what you can do with leftover bread, and things like that. Then we are going to have a little bit of a shorter of a politics episode. We're just going to talk about a couple of issues. I really just want to hit upon a few things concerning the war in Ukraine, and then that's going to be it. There will be no show next week because I will be away, and then we will pick up, hopefully, unless anything changes, with episode 37 on March 18th. So with that, let's get started. So, say you have too much bread and you, I don't know, are heading for a trip for a week and don't know what to do with it. Or you are about to hit the end of your bread shelf life and you want to save it and savor it so that way you don't waste any bread. So, what are some great ways you can do that? So, let's start with the dilemma of you've made bread and you don't have a lot of time to eat it. So, the first thing you can do is just to freeze that bread so that it's ready for you later. And the way you want to freeze a loaf of bread is you want to make sure that when you're covering it, you do two things. One, you cover it at least two layers of whatever it is you're using. I recommend aluminum foil. And second, you want to make sure you cover it in such a way that there are no possible air holes or escapes or anything like that. That allows for you to make sure that there's no way that your bread can kind of get that weird frosty, that can get like frostbite isn't really the right term. It's what's it called? Freezer burn. There we go. That's the one. So that way you make sure your bread doesn't get freezer burn. Now, mind you, your bread's probably not going to get freezer burn if you're just leaving it for about a week. But if you need to freeze your bread for a little longer, like a couple of weeks, then you might want to consider about how to make sure you're not getting freezer burn. So when you're covering your bread, regardless of the bread shape, make sure that you're covering it completely. And even if you have to use multiple pieces of whatever it is you're using, like foil, for example, that still constitutes one layer if you're only putting down one version of it on top of your loaf of bread. Now, you want to make sure you do multiple layers, at least two, to make sure that you don't have an issue with your bread getting freezer burn while it's in the freezer, okay? And then once you're ready to use it again, it depends on the bread, but most breads you're going to be able to throw in the oven at about 350 degrees for about 30 or 40 minutes. Now you'll know your bread is defrosted if you open it up and kind of feel it. It'll feel soft and squishy. It'll kind of feel like it's been freshly baked. It'll smell freshly baked. And that's kind of how you'll know that it is ready for you to eat. Now, if you have a thermometer, that's obviously the best and safest way to do this is just to poke it in the middle and make sure that center is around room temperature, 70 degrees. You don't need it much. You don't need the inside to be hot because you're not re-cooking the bread, right? The purpose of defrosting it is just that, right? To make sure that the inside and the whole bread is above freezing temperatures. So when you're reheating your bread, just make sure that you are checking it fairly frequently, right? I recommend half an hour to 45 minutes for a frozen bread, but it depends. If you got a bigger bread, it's going to take longer. If you got a smaller bread, it's going to take a shorter amount of time. Also, it also depends on what kind of bread. If you have a bread that has a lot more air pockets in it, versus a bread that's very dense, the bake times are also going to be different. So again, it's less important that you set a time on a timer, but more important that you're checking it regularly and make sure that you've got the kind of the right feel to it, the right temperature on it, and then it looks and feels like it's ready to be eaten again. Okay, so that's what happens if you want to store bread for a long period of time. But what about if you just have too much bread and you want to make something else with it? So there's two roads you can go with this one. Personally, I like to go the sweet route, but a lot of people, understandably, want to go the savory route. So if you're going for the sweet route, I always recommend the easiest thing you can do is to make either French toast or like a French toast casserole. So French toast, you all know, you make it into slices, you dip it in an eggy mixture. Typically, that's like 1 or 2 eggs, half a cup of milk, some sugar, and some cinnamon. And then you put it in a frying pan with some butter, you fry it up both sides, coat it with syrup on all your favorite toppings. Or you could make a French toast casserole, which instead of cutting your bread into slices, what you do instead is you cube your bread. So you take the loaf of bread, you cut it into much thicker slices, and then you cut all those slices into little cube pieces, right? And then once you've done that, you take all of those and you put them in a baking container. I usually use glass, like a 9 by 9, like a square container for the most part, because I don't often have a ton of bread left over. But you want to use something that makes it so that you have a little bit of stack in your layer of bread. You don't want it all one big flat layer of bread unless you have a lot of bread that you're doing this with, right? After that, depending on the size of the pan, but for a 9 by 9, you want to use something like 3 or 4 eggs with 1 or 2 cups of milk, quarter cup to half a cup of sugar, and 1 to 2 tablespoons of cinnamon. You mix this all together and then you just pour it all over your bread mixture, chuck it in the oven at around 400 degrees, and let it sit for 30, 40 minutes. Now, again, test it, make sure the egg is completely cooked through all the way because it's not going to cook as it cools down. And then once you've done that, just serve again with fruit or syrup or anything you want. Now that's your savory route. Now, so your sweet route. Your savory route, you can go a number of ways. If your bread is super stale, you can go the croutons route if you want to. You can intentionally toast your bread and then cut it into crouton sizes, or you can cut first and then toast, depending on what you want to do. You can also make your bread into breadcrumbs if you want to just cut the bread into slices, put it cut those slices into small pieces and then throw them into a food processor. You can create breadcrumbs that you can use. Now, mind you, you'll probably want to toast those, especially if the bread is getting towards the end of its life. So that way you don't have moldy breadcrumbs or breadcrumbs that are, past their due, as it were. But you can use them pretty immediately, right? And we all know the applications for breadcrumbs, deep frying things, and the like. And also meatloaf, right? And other things. So if you don't want to make breadcrumbs and you want to go the kind of casserole route, you can go with like a dinner style casserole, or you can go with like a breakfast style casserole. So your breakfast style casserole is pretty easy. You're going to take your bread cubes, just like you will have done for your sweet French toast casserole. You're going to put the cubes in a similarly sized container, depending on how many you have, and then you're going to want to use like 12 to 15 eggs, right? You really want this is going to be pretty thick on the egg department, and then a pound of whatever breakfast meat of your choosing, sausage rounds, bacon, ham, what have you, cut into appropriate size pieces and cooked if required. And then you're going to mix all that into the egg, and you're going to pour that egg again on top of those breadcrumbs in the oven, 400 degrees for 30, 40 minutes. And then if you want, like sprinkle some chives or spring onions on top. That's in your breakfast casserole. And then finally, if you're looking for like a dinner casserole, you can do it a number of ways. Obviously, you can create layers and put the bread on top. Or if you want to do kind of the egg and pour way that we've been talking about for these other ones, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to use slightly fewer eggs, but you're going to want to increase the number of other ingredients you use, right? So say you only use 8 to 12 eggs instead of 12 to 15 eggs. You want to put things like cooked vegetables, or just other vegetables, right? If that's what you're interested in, cut up vegetables, lots of cheese, any meats that you might be interested in, like a rotisserie chicken, like a shredded chicken would be really great for this, or another type of shredded meat. And then you pour that on top. Now this one, because you're not intentionally layering it this way, you can actually go and mix everything together to make sure that your breadcrumbs are thoroughly covered, that the disbursement of meat and vegetables and everything else is the way you want it. Sprinkle some final cheese on if that's what you're interested in. Once again, chuck it in that oven about 400 degrees, and then make sure that you're checking it every 25 minutes. So check the first 25 minutes. It's not done then. You want to give it another 10 minutes, another 10 minutes, another 10 minutes until it's cooked through. And again, cooked through for all of these dishes where you're making casseroles with egg is the egg is not at all runny at all. It's fully cooked through. It's essentially like souffle consistency. And so that is what you do if you have too much bread and you don't know what to do with it. Hopefully, this baby segment of Let Them Eat Bread has taught you something that you can use if you have too much bread, or if you just want to go to the store, buy an extra loaf of bread, stale it yourself in the oven, and then use it for one of these applications. I personally do this with all of my extra bread so that I'm not wasting any, and I find that it's a great way to make bulk meals that are easy. You just slice them up, chuck them in the microwave, and then you have bulk meals for as long as you need, and bulk breakfast as long as you need. So I find it's a really great way to do that. So we're going to move to our politics portion here. Again, I'm just going to cover a couple of issues, a couple of things that I have seen that I wanted to comment on, and then this is going to be a really short episode, guys. So these will get cut up to the extent they can be, put onto YouTube, debuted on Monday, just like we always do, and then you'll see me again for episode 37 on March 18th. So for our usual segment of the week that doesn't get made into a separate YouTube video and you kind of have to watch live, the UN kind of sucks, right? So what does that mean, right? So should we have world cooperation? Yes, of course we should have world cooperation. As a leftist, I am very much in favor of cooperation. Obviously, the alternative is very bad, just like we're seeing in Ukraine right now. But when I say the UN kind of sucks, I mean the UN is essentially as useful as the collective will and buy-in of all the member states are, right? So if for any reason the United Nations, so first of all, the UN has its own problems, right? So the five permanent members of the Security Council who have veto power over Security Council resolutions, that's a huge problem. Not just because it's unfair to other countries, but if you look at the countries who do have veto power, the US, France, China, Great Britain, and Russia, we're really not the best stewards of world peace anyway, right? On there you have two colonial powers, a warmongering power, a neo-colonial power, and China. And China's, they haven't done some of these other things, but their record isn't great either. But essentially, it means that those five permanent member states who have veto power can essentially do anything they want, and the United Nations is not going to be able to respond to it because they can just say, no, I don't think so. We're not going to do that. Now, there's some cases where they can't overrule rights, so there's a General Assembly vote. But again, what is a General Assembly vote, right? And this is what I want to talk about. The United Nations doesn't have any way to fundamentally enforce the things that it does. In the United Nations Charter, there isn't a page on, hey, this is the type of economic sanctions that we're going to impose on people who don't follow our instructions, right? Or who don't buy into our institutions. So if it's going to work, everyone has to agree, just like the International Criminal Court too, right? It has problems as well, but it has typically been a better force than the UN. Everyone in the UN has to agree that, hey, regardless of what happens, good or bad, we are going to abide by these rules. And by the way, this level of buy-in has to span multiple levels of leadership within a country, right? So it regardless of who is in power in these countries, they all have to agree that they're going to do what the UN is telling them to do. And oftentimes that's difficult because the UN will ask a country to do things that it doesn't want to do, and then the most obvious response for the leader of a country is to just ignore what the UN says because the UN has no power over them, and the leader is more responsible for the people in most cases, right? Who will either elect them or who's by whose assent they are in power or what have you. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this is because we're really seeing this in terms of what's going on in Ukraine, because when there was an initial resolution to tut the Russians for invading Ukraine, do you know what Russia did as a permanent and veto member of the Security Council? They vetoed it, right? And then all of a sudden, oops, now there's no message from the United Nations because Russia said no. Interestingly, China abstained. Fascinating. Anyway, not really important. So essentially, the attitude that a lot of leaders have towards the UN is, you and what army, right? So why do I have to listen to you? I don't, because you can't force me to do what you're saying to do. Now, maybe if the UN were to revise under a system where it had more power to enforce things like economic sanctions, or it had the ability to cut organizations off from, SWIFT, for example, or the World Bank, or whatever it was going to be, right? Just some way to enforce their dictates, then sure, maybe we could have a conversation about the UN being an organization that actually furthers world peace and is able to allow for the majoritarian will of nations to govern all nations. But it doesn't have that, right? And because and especially because it has no standing army and no standing sanction ability, countries with economic, large economies and large militaries just don't see the value of doing anything that NATO says, except for to quote NATO when NATO does something that the country already likes, right? So this is kind of what I mean by that the UN kind of sucks, because as much as it could be a force for good if it had teeth, it just doesn't have the teeth to do what it needs to do, which is to further and to further world peace and to create situations where the people of the world can rely on it to ensure peace and tranquility and things like that, right? So I just if I had a magic wand, I would give the UN some kind of authority, not an army, because I don't like the idea of making it into like a war organization or whatever, like NATO is, or something like that. If I had a magic wand, I would just give them some kind of access to, the levers of financial power. That way, they could at least exact a punishment of some kind, of a mostly peaceful kind, onto other countries for not doing what it says and for not furthering world peace. And I just think that the UN would be a better organization if it had some kind of power like that, but it doesn't. So here we are. So I've seen a lot of these Facebook posts, and I'm sure you've seen them too, and they're not just on Facebook, they're pretty much everywhere, where some headline happily exclaims, Russian vodka removed from shelves of bars in this country, or Russian potatoes not eaten here, or changing the name of poutine to Ukraine, or I don't actually know what they renamed it, but essentially there's a lot of xenophobia going around with concerns to Russia. And does it make sense for people to want to be upset at Russia and to want to feel like they can do something? Yes, of course it does. The government of Russia and the military of Russia have done terrible things, right? And we, as regular people, we want to feel like we have some ability to, to exercise our frustrations in the world in a meaningful way, right? And oftentimes this kind of looks like it can do good. But this is a really bad idea, right? Not only because polls have come out of Russia during the very beginning of the war. I'm sure these numbers have changed, saying that at least 50% of the population is not in favor of this conflict whatsoever. But also, and more importantly, most of the Russians are innocent bystanders here. And by the way, in a lot of cases, that means the soldiers too. What's interesting is that captured Russians. There are reports recently that captured Russian soldiers are admitting to the Ukrainian jailers that they thought they'd be greeted as liberators. And by the way, quick pause here. For any soldiers that might be listening to me or anyone like me, if anyone in command ever tells you the words "you will be greeted as liberators," it's a lie. They're lying to you. You're not going to be greeted as liberators. You're going to be fiercely resisted. The being greeted as liberators thing has literally never been true. It wasn't true in the Falkland Islands. It wasn't true in Iraq. It wasn't true in any other system. It has been in any other situation in which that language has been used. It has never been true. Ever, 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 ever been true that soldiers will be greeted as liberators. Soldiers don't bring liberation for the most part. They bring death and destruction, right? Perhaps the only time that I can think of that soldiers were greeted as liberators was in World War II, because there were people literally in death camps. But that's probably it. There probably isn't any other reason that soldiers would be greeted as liberators. So let's just let's just ignore that. And if you hear that from someone, just know they're lying to you. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh yes, ordinary Russians. So most Russians are innocent bystanders in this, and there are very few Russians who are actually actively fueling, no pun intended, the war effort. And so those are petro oligarchs and billionaires who have great influence in the Russian government, who aren't necessarily tied to oil, right? So minerals, coal barons, oil barons, um, you know, owners of large uh, natural resource companies. Those are the types of people who are actively creating problems for the Ukrainian people by their support of Putin, who is using the Russian military to, create problems in Ukraine. So, saying things, and I saw this on TV too, like kick Russian students out of the US. Like, no, don't do that. The Russians don't want this. And even if a Russian person is in favor of this, right? Worst case scenario, they're all gung ho about this. It still doesn't make sense to use that as an excuse to hate all things Russian. It doesn't make any sense. I'm part Russian. Do you hate me because of that? Like, it's just dumb. It's just really stupid. And more importantly than it just being stupid is you are not meaningfully helping anyone with this nonsense. What you're doing is you're showing how limited the imagination of individuals are as they have these conversations on the world stage, where all of a sudden we say Russia good or Russia bad or Ukraine good or Ukraine bad. It's not that simple. And to talk about it that way and to make these broad general assumptions creates xenophobia and is also just super small minded. Like, if your reaction to the conflict in Ukraine was to stop buying Russian vodka, you lost the plot. You just aren't, you're not making a difference. I'm sorry, you're just not. What you are doing is you are finding an excuse for xenophobia. Whether you harbored that xenophobia beforehand or not, that's on you. I can't say whether you did or didn't, but that's all it is. It's just a manifestation of xenophobia to people who are not deserving of it. Not that anybody is, of course, but it doesn't make a difference. It hurts people, and we should stop doing it. So, if you drink Russian vodka, enjoy Russian vodka. If you like Russian recipes or Russian dishes or whatever, keep enjoying them. If you like Russian restaurants, keep enjoying them, because truthfully, they're not going to them is going to hurt regular Russian people who have nothing to do with this, and is not going to hurt the Russian war effort, which has nothing to do with your favorite Russian restaurant. Okay, so keep using Russian dressing, keep drinking Russian vodka. You're not helping the war effort by stopping doing that things. So don't do it. It's stupid. So a couple weeks back on the show, I talked about Poland and their conflict with Belarus in terms of immigration, specifically when it comes to Poland accusing Belarus of sending immigrants to Poland to, well, whatever it was that Poland was accusing them of doing. But Poland was coming out there saying, we're the last bastion stopping all these people coming into Europe. And my response was, just let them in. They're just immigrants. They're escaping terrible situations. They're trying to make the best of a situation that they can't control. So let them in. So now there is new immigrants on the Polish border. Many Ukrainians who are fleeing the conflict with Russia are heading towards Poland. And it sounds like, for the most part, Poland has been a good neighbor, which is great. But it, unfortunately, is not all roses and daisies. Sunshine and roses? Sunshine and roses. There we go. It's not all sunshine and roses, because there have been rampant reports by Al Jazeera and the New York Times and CNN and tons of organizations have reported this. And they've interviewed people. I mean, it's not conjecture, that essentially, if you're white or Russian looking, you can come in, and if you're Ukrainian of any other type, maybe you stay out. And first of all, we should not be treating refugees any different. Even before that, we should not treat refugees any different when they're coming from the same country. But on top of that, we should also not treat refugees any different, regardless of what country they're coming from. If you are fleeing your country, it means something really bad is happening to you, is about to happen to you, and you're trying to find a better life. Okay? What you want to do is get a roof over your head. You want to work. You want to put your children through school if you have any, and you want to protect your family from whatever it was that you're running from. And if, regardless of whether we had anything to do with the reason that they're running from whatever it is that they're running from, it is our moral obligation as fellow human beings. Forget nationalities, forget race, forget all that religion, forget all that nonsense. If another human being is running from something, we as fellow human beings have a responsibility to protect them, right? That's all we got. We're one species on one planet, right? That's it. There's no, so all this, I was really, it warmed my heart a lot to hear that Poland was doing really great work for the Ukrainians, and that lots of Polish people had offered their homes to Ukrainians. But it made me think of that story that we'd done on the show a couple weeks ago about how Poland was, not letting in certain types of refugees from Africa or from Turkey. And there's a lot of racism involved in this. And look, I'm not one of those people who looks at racism and thinks that it's the reason for so many things, but in this case, it's pretty obvious. I mean, essentially, like they're all like, especially in some of the stories that I've seen, it's like a group of Ukrainians will go through and I'm like, okay, you who all happen to be white, you can come in, and you all who happen to be not white, and we don't know where you're from. Yeah, you do. They're coming from Ukraine. In fact, many of them are crossing at the same border point, so you can't even make the argument that you don't know where they're coming from. They're very obviously coming from Ukraine. So the moral of this story is essentially, regardless of where they're coming from or why they're coming from there, take them in, right? If you can't give them resources, I get it, right? It's difficult to be one country and to be seeing all these people coming through and be able to give them all resources. I get that, really, I do. But you have to let them come in, and you have to give them a chance, whether they see that there's no resources in your country and go on to another country, or whether they stay in your country and try and eke out a living. Whatever it is that they decide to do, let them be safe first. Let them come in. If you have to process them a certain kind of way, fine, right? I'm not saying that you have to, settle in your country every single person who comes through. But these people are fleeing war and famine and climate change and all these things. Please, for the love of everything sacred to you, for the sake of your fellow human beings, just let them in. Please. So there's been a lot of talk recently about the prospect of a no-fly zone over Ukraine in response to Russian aggression. Um, Russia has a pretty solid air force. I'm not sure what extent they're using that air force in the Ukraine conflict. I haven't really seen a ton of reports on the extent that the air force of Russia is being used in the conflict. But Russia does have an air force, right? So it seemingly would make sense to create a no-fly zone over Ukraine. And Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has actually asked on the world stage for a no-fly zone to be put over Ukraine. So before we continue about whether that's a good idea, and it's not, I want to explain what a no-fly zone is. So a no-fly zone is a militarily enforced demarcation over an area that says no planes or aircraft of a certain type can fly here. And the reason I emphasize militarily enforced is because you can't just say no fly zone and then people start, oh, okay, well, they say no fly zone, so we're just not going to go there, right? Oftentimes, most times, all the time, that has to be enforced by someone else, right? And Ukraine doesn't have an air force that we're aware of, and if they did, they certainly can't enforce it over themselves. I mean, I'm sure they're going to try, but someone else would have to enforce it, right? And essentially, what Volodymyr Zelensky is looking for is for someone else to enforce it, which means that if if you get into a situation and you're enforcing the no-fly zone and you see someone who's on the no-fly list, you have to ask them to leave, and if they don't, you have to shoot them down and kill them. Okay. Now it's different with commercial airspace, yada yada, but in this case, we're talking about a war zone. So if a nation was to say, if a nation or a group of nations was to say, we're enforcing a no-fly zone over Ukraine, that means that they have to patrol it with jets and helicopters, and they have to attack anyone who's not allowed to be there. Hopefully you can see where this is going. The reason the no-fly zone is a terrible idea is because if we, the United States, or any other NATO country, or any other nuclear-armed country, or even any other European country enforces a no-fly zone over Ukraine, we are going to get to nuclear war, because it will put us in a situation, and I know that sounds like hyperbole, but it isn't. It will put us in a direct trajectory for direct conventional conflict with more than one nuclear-armed power. Right now, we have a nuclear armed power and a non-nuclear armed power fighting a conventional ground war in Ukraine, okay? And look, ground wars are scary and terrible, and what's going on is awful, and I have said this a million times. But if another country intervenes, especially a nuclear armed country, you risk the process of nuclear war. And the way that that would escalate would be that a no-fly zone, someone shoots down a Russian plane, and that plane is shot down by whatever country. So if the U.S. was to enforce a no-fly zone, then at some point a U.S. fighter jet has to shoot down a Russian fighter jet, or vice versa, which is potentially even worse, because America does not react well when we are attacked, right? So if we and it doesn't have to be us. It could be any nation that Volodymyr Zelensky is asking to enforce a no-fly zone. If any of them do it, we are all screwed. End of humanity level nonsense here, okay? So just be careful with asking for additional escalation, military escalation, in terms of like a no-fly zone or anything similar, because if that's the road we go down, ultimately we are creating a situation where we will create a war that we cannot turn back from. We will put ourselves in a situation that we cannot return from. And quite frankly, the old joke about millennials not being able to retire, I thought it was because our money was going to be worth nothing. We'd have to work forever, not because, we literally wouldn't live long enough to retire. Okay. I would like to live past the next couple of years. And a nuclear annihilation makes that look pretty bleak. So if you could all just not, call for a no-fly zone, that'd be great. I would really appreciate, not being nuked to high heaven. That'd be wonderful. And yeah, a no-fly zone is a terrible idea. It would not help the people of Ukraine. And even if it did, it would come at a terrible cost. And it's a cost that we, the world, simply cannot afford. All right, so I have seen a lot of hero worship going on in the last couple of days concerning the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And look, there are some heroes, and there are people who have acted heroically. Those two things are separate, by the way. And it's good to have heroes. But this is a real war with real nuances. This isn't some fairy tale or storybook. Sure, there are people who've done heroic things, right? There are people who have had badass responses to aggression, right? Like the guy, like the soldiers on Snake Island who told the Russian warship to go fuck itself. That clip has been gaining popularity. There was an old woman who told the soldiers to put sunflower seeds in their pockets so that when they were killed in Ukraine, they would at least, that sunflowers would grow from them, right? And we look at those and we want to empathize. We want to kind of, give credence to those heroic narratives that people are doing things that are scary, right? They're participating in a way they're looking in the face of danger, and they're walking into the abyss, right? And we want to celebrate that, and there's nothing wrong with that, okay? But you know, posts from people talking about, oh, I saw this on Twitter. Every woman has a crush on Volodymyr Zelensky right now, and there's nothing you can do about it. Dude, relax, okay? First of all, keep in your pants. Second of all, that's like, sure, he hasn't necessarily done anything wrong that we know of, but this isn't like a TV show with awesome characters, right? He's a politician. His country's being attacked. He's defending his country, right? And is that heroic? Yes. Is he a hero? No, it does not really how that works. And the reason I'm just so careful about using hero to describe these people is because we in the United States and people broadly kind of have this hero worship culture, right? And we just need to stop doing that, because then we start to not see them as people who are fallible, but as kind of idols who can't do wrong, and should be celebrated for everything they do. And look, all that aside, it's if you want to celebrate what Volodymyr Zelensky is doing by staying in Kiev, by by sticking it out, by making these addresses, by pumping up the nation, yes, those are good things, and we expect good leaders to do them. But it doesn't make him a hero, okay? And it doesn't make him a hero, especially because then once you get there, you got people fawning over him, right? And fawning over Ukraine, and people are celebrating Ukraine, and that's great. But that causes for certain things to not be brought to the surface. So, for example, one of the things that Putin talked about when he was talking about the invasion of Ukraine was denazifying Ukraine. Now, on the surface, that looks completely ridiculous, right? Volodymyr Zelensky is Jewish. His parents or grandparents died in the Holocaust. And, grandparents, I guess, died in the Holocaust. And, it's very obvious that there's not a Nazi government in power in Ukraine. However, there is a micro kernel of truth in all of that is kind of being whitewashed with this hero narrative that we're getting about Ukraine. So there is a battalion within the Ukrainian military called the Azov Battalion, and they are literally card-carrying Nazis. They believe in the murdering of all Jews. They believe in an ethno-state. They are literally Nazis. They call themselves Nazis. You can look it up, Azov Battalion. In Ukraine. Okay, so in that, and by the way, the U.S. funded them. We gave them money and we gave them weapons. So is that an excuse to invade Ukraine? No, of course it's not. But these are important things to keep in mind that get washed over when we create a hero culture around a country or a person or a set of people. Okay. At the same time, we're also seeing things that are getting washed away. The Kiev Independent reported a couple days ago that the Ukrainian military will no longer be peacefully capturing surrendered Russian soldiers. Now they talk specifically about artillerymen, so let's just keep with what the headline said. Now they've deleted the tweet, but many people have captured a screenshot of that tweet while it was still up. But the Kiev Independent had reported that the Ukrainian forces were no longer going to capture Russian artillerymen. So what else do you do with someone who's surrendered if you're not going to capture them? Well, you kill them, right? So it was an admission of brazen war crimes, but no one talks about it because we have this giant hero complex about Ukraine. Okay, so look, it's a war. It's messy. People are going to do terrible, horrible things to other people, and all of it is bad. It's bad when the Russians do it. It's bad when the Ukrainians do it. But in order to continue to hold accountable, in order to continue to hold each other accountable as people, as nations, we can't create hero complexes for people or nation states. Because as soon as we do, we whitewash, we erase the bad things that they do and only focus on the bad things that others do. We create hero and villain narratives, which are extremely dangerous. They lead to xenophobia and to all the other nonsense that I talked about in my xenophobia segment. So please, as much as possible, get varying perspectives on this conflict where you can. Do not create hero complexes of either Putin or Zelensky, okay? We need to be looking at this from one perspective and one perspective only. How do we make peace? Because at this point, that's what we really need. We don't need to make Zelensky into a hero. We don't need to make Putin into a hero. We don't need to make Zelensky into a villain. We don't need to make Putin into a villain, okay? War is a terrible, terrible thing. People will do terrible things and they will think that they are justified. And no matter what you tell them, they are always going to think that the terrible thing that they are doing is justified because of some other terrible thing. So, you know how we stop all of that? We don't create heroes, we don't create villains, we create peace. And that is the only thing that can stop the travesty, the tragedy that is going on right now. So, please, I beg of you, don't create hero and villain complexes of nations, of leaders. It doesn't help anyone. And what it allows people to do is it allows them to hide behind that hero complex to do terrible things and then for it to be swept under the rug because heroes only do good things. All right, guys, that is it for this week. So please make something fun with your leftover bread. Enjoy the week off. I'm definitely going to. I will be out of town, so I'll be having a great time. I will see you guys on March 18th, and we will have our next episode then with a brand new recipe. All right, guys, take care.
Thanks for watching this video, guys. If you liked it, throw a like on it, share with your friends, and subscribe for more of our content. You can also find all of our videos and clips on youtube.com. Just search Let Them Eat Bread and you'll find all of our content. Alright guys, see you next time. Bye for now.